Hi, I'm Chance.
And I'm Sarah Catherine.
And this is Conservation Connection,
presented by Last Chance Endeavors.
We run a wildlife education nonprofit focused on connecting students to their environment.
Each week here on Conservation Connection, we do just that by introducing you to the groundbreaking science and conservation work that's happening every day around the country.
We talk to professionals in the world of conservation science and wildlife management and ask them about their career,
their current projects,
their wild and crazy stories from the field,
and everything in between.
Join us each week to discover just how these dedicated people are working to protect our planet.
Today, we are talking with Dr. Paul Gaze. He is the Executive Director at the Burroughs and Chapin Center for Marine and Wetland Studies with the Coastal Carolina University.
Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me.
For our audience, we're actually on a beautiful boat. Which waterway are we on?
This is Georgetown Harbor in South Carolina, just off Winyaw Bay.
Awesome.
And we're sitting on the Coastal Explorer, the name of the vessel, right?
Yes, it is.
She's a beautiful boat. I'm really sad this is a podcast right now because I wish you guys listening could see this. It's a pretty wonderful setting to be recording at.
Yeah. I thought it'd be an interesting spot for you to have this discussion on the vessel. We do a lot of the research we talk about.
I mean, you can just feel the science sitting here, just permeating the boat. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, sometimes science smells, but this is a pretty cool place to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what exactly does your job as Executive Director, what does that entail?
We've really been in charge of the research focus at the university in Marine and Wetland Studies for some time. We have academic departments that are much more engaged in the teaching and delivering of that kind of content, and they're engaging students in research. The center is really trying to build that research capacity and support the university in that regard, but also support our region, our communities, and our state by bringing needed science to address societally relevant problems.
And what exactly is that science? I know that what you do is a really broad range because it's very interdisciplinary, but what are you guys looking at?
Well, it is. We live in the coastal zone, like many coastal states, and it's challenged by so many different problems. I mean, in reality, we have so many people moving to the coastal zone, and we have a coastal zone that's moving itself because the sea is rising. It's been rising, and it's going to continue to rise, and there is the conflict. So this area is so important environmentally. It's so important economically, and it's important historically, culturally. It's so unique, but it's under a lot of pressure. So we're trying to bring the best understanding we can about how it works in the broadest sense, so that we can make good decisions to maintain the quality of the environment, which is ultimately the quality and vibrancy of our economy and our culture.
That was a pretty tidy summary of what it is that you guys do. That was pretty impressive.
Surprised you, did I?
Yeah, there you go.
I gotta say. So we're sitting here on this amazing research vessel. Can you tell me a little bit about the history of this vessel?
So historically, we've been really specialized in a couple of areas. We do a great deal of geophysical work, a lot of different techniques or instruments that allow you to sense the environment like remote sensing. So these would be instruments that allow you to map the seafloor, map what's below the seafloor. Others, such as what's on the vessel right now for a cruise tomorrow, is allow you to image in the water column in terms of the currents and directions the water's going. So it's a kind of a broad array of instrumentation and observations you can make off the platform.
So what made you get into this field? As a kid, were you just like, man, this is really what I want to do? Or did you kind of stumble into it?
Well, it's pretty surprising. You might imagine from time to time one reflects on such things.
Yeah.
And I have done that. And it turns out it's not a surprise. I can point back to 3 successive years in elementary school and a 4th grade teacher that was really into geology. He had us as a 4th grade class writing letters to rock clubs all around the world, and they would send in boxes and crates of rocks to the point where the post office was complaining to the school about just how many things we were getting delivered. And we ended up with this incredible rock collection. And so we got interested in some of the geosciences. I can trace that back there if you like. The next year, and it was a teacher that was interested in archaeology, and he would actually take us out on archaeology archaeological digs on weekends with a group in the area that was investigating Indian sites and things like that.
Wow.
And,
I wish I was in that class.
Oh,
that sounds amazing.
And the next year was someone that was into marine science, and he would walk the class down to the harbor and look at the environment there. And that wasn't the intent going into college, but after a year or two into college, I found out those are the classes I'm taking. And now 30 years later, this is what I'm doing.
That's amazing.
That's pretty incredible. I've definitely got a soft spot for rock collections and mineral collections. I've tried to pinpoint what it is about these crazy mineral formations that really captures me. And I think what it is as someone who came from primarily a biological background, looking at living things that create their own complex apparatuses and organs, the Earth does the same thing across a very different time scale, but it's the same thing. It's the passage of time leaving marks and clues and trails that if we take the time and have the technology, we can interpret those and read so much about what's happened across geological time.
It's hard not to think about it. I've offered a class many years ago. It was geology in North America, and we drive all the way across the country with a group of undergraduate students and then hike down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and 12 days rafting through the canyon and hiking up side canyons. And in that setting, you can go and put your finger on something called the Great Unconformity, and there's 1 billion years of time missing. I mean, you think of geology being the pages of the book of time to read. There's gaps in it, and 1 billion years is missing. It's hard not to think about what 1 billion years means, and how do things work on that scale? Is it progressively every day whittle away, and the mountain chains are gone, and then they come back? So really, it opens the mind to think about things in terms of time and scales, spatial and temporal scales, and it's very applicable in the modern. Well, many of the things we work on now, we are concerned about what happens during an individual storm event, but the reality is, in terms of the system, it may be the sequence of storms, how frequently they come together. Recently, we've had significant storms every year for the last 5 years, and the overall system responds to the one jolt, but it's responding more systemically to the change in frequency in a bigger way that we're just starting to learn about. So those are the kinds of perspectives that I think are important for us as a society. There's decisions we make today. There's decisions we make for the next year. But think about it. Our infrastructure, our roads, our major movements in how we develop things in a society typically are on a longer time period. They're interannual to decadal. It takes a while to build a highway. It takes a while to build a town. So I think we're getting into those time frames that I'm particularly interested in, is that from the event scale to maybe 100 years, and we can observe an event really well because we've lived through some hurricanes. In 100 years, we can say, well, this was here 100 years ago, here it is now, but we didn't have the data in between. I'm really interested in that in between. What's happening on the interannual to decadal scales? So
you're kind of starting a war on two fronts. You've got an understanding of what happens on a relatively long-term scale, and we've got the technology now to really understand what happens in a single event. And a lot of your work is trying to tie together how does a series of individual events result in what we know is the long-term trend in a lot of different ways.
And not only is it a series of individual events, it's a series of different perspectives of looking at it. There's things that are happening from physical forcing, waves, currents, winds. There's things that are happening from biological forcings, responses to waves, winds, currents, responses to changes in temperature, acidification, all the kinds of concerns that are in here in our world. There's these feedbacks and responses across disciplines. So we've always been very interested in the marine sciences, the environmental sciences, because to do it well, you really have to look across boundaries, not only of time and space, but the disciplines of the sciences you're applying.
So speaking of these timelines and the changes that you've seen, what's some of the research you're doing currently that looks into those timelines and what's happening?
Well, a lot of our focus these days is really on the same trajectory we've been on for 30 years. And it basically what our world needs from science is predictive capabilities. It's no longer helpful just to go in and describe how something is occurring and saying this is bad or this is good. We have to be able to say this is what will happen if we do this or don't do that. And so as that's evolved, they spent a lot of time looking at coastal erosion as a real concern and how beaches behave and renourishment projects. We've worked a lot in terms of climate change and sea level and how environments respond to sea levels change, not just on a storm, but over hundreds of years or 1,000 years. But the real focus that we've come to to is now to do that better and to get it into a predictive mode is we need to get more observations, diverse observations across spatial scales more closely located together so that we can understand the actual mechanisms and drivers on the scales of the problems we're trying to predict. So if we're talking about a storm surge that might come in and how that will flood into some interior areas in which communities, we really need to understand the physics of how that works and how it interacts even with the land surface and the winds at the time, as well as things like groundwater. In our part of the world, groundwater really is a big player in many of our rivers. The ground gets saturated and the flood from the runoff happens quickly, but it's 8-10 days later you see the pulse come from this other mechanism that brings it into the system. So we really need to look at it in that holistic regard. So we're making different kinds of sensors with some partners at Florida Atlantic University, the Institute for Sensing and Embedded Network Engineering. These are really clever people that know how to make electronics and deal with large data sets. And we have things that we need electronics and data sets to do. So we keep kind of challenging and going back and forth. And it's been a really fun experience in that regard. But ultimately, it's getting more observations at scales that we can better understand the environment, better predict it for any number of things: erosion, flooding, hypoxia, water quality, whatever it may be.
It's a whole different suite of things, yeah. So how long have you been in this field?
Well, it started a position here at Coastal Carolina in 1987. It's been quite a while.
So it's been a while. So
it's been a while.
How is where we are today with our ability to collect data different from where we were when you started?
Well, technology's come so very far, and so is computational capacity. I mean, many of the modeling efforts for how, say, beaches work back many years ago were limited by, you had to simplify the algorithms so that they could run efficiently on the computing capacity you had. Now, there's so much more capacity on your laptop than there was, many, many years ago. So you can be more accurate, more correct in describing how things work, as well as how they interact and feedback. So that's been a big effort. And similarly, as more time's gone by and we've observed more things and we've been challenged to explain them, we have better understanding all the way along. And I think we've gotten quite good at some things in the field. You're seeing some of the projections now about climate change. And for many, many years, that was projected, and we weren't really entirely seeing what was being talked about back in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. The things you're seeing now are what's been predicted in the last 10, 20 years. So this is a good bit of vindication that we're getting better at the predicting capabilities that we need.
Now, those sensors that you mentioned earlier that you said you're working with Florida Atlantic,
Mm-hmm.
What are you looking at with those?
With those in particular, we've had a number of different kinds of projects. Some of them are, say, water quality related. We had instrumentation in the Savannah River with Clemson University and Florida Atlantic from the mountains all the way to the sea. And the goal was, how can you develop a technology and a capacity to observe on a watershed scale? So those sensors were water quality. They were looking at dissolved oxygen and temperature and other parameters in the water, but they were beaming data out every 10 minutes for 3.5 years.
Wow.
And figuring out the logistics of how do you do that. So that was a water quality oriented effort. We've had some where we've put med-ocean buoys looking at meteorological and oceanographic behavior, a string of them right here off of Georgetown out to 12 miles. We had 3 buoys in a line, and off of North Myrtle Beach, and we're looking at waves and currents and temperature, salinity, as well as wind and weather phenomenon. And the goal in that was really towards a renewable energy focus. We were trying to determine what the wind resource capacity is for potentially putting a wind farm off the coast of South Carolina. And then other observations are even long-term behaving of our beach systems. We've been doing a lot of monitoring of beach erosion in South Carolina since the 1990s. And so we have a very interesting data set that's now spanning 2 decades about how our beaches are modifying and changing over time and with different storm events. So we're interested in that whole integration of how our environment works.
Now, I know you guys do a lot with offshore wind farms. You've done quite a significant amount of work. So as someone who's not incredibly involved in this field, it's not my background. When I think of wind farm, I think a terrestrial wind farm, a terrestrial turbine. So what are some of the benefits and maybe drawbacks to offshore wind farms?
So offshore is actually a really significant resource. If you look at what the wind resources for the United States is, you'll see that there's a pretty good amount of wind resource that's in the mid-continent from the Dakotas down to Texas. where there's a lot of wind farms being developed on land these days. Iowa, for example, I think is almost 30% wind-generated electricity for the state at this point. And there's a lot of expansion in the mid-state. But in places, say, where there's a lot of wind in the Dakotas, for example, there's not maybe as many people. The people and the load is on the coast. Fortunately, if you look at the resources, there's even better resources right off the coast. On the East Coast, there's really strong resources. They really are quite extensive in the Gulf of Maine all the way down through the Mid-Atlantic. In the Southeast, it starts to drop off a little bit, but it starts in this area. There's been a number of projects we've been working on, not only looking at the wind resources, but where you would optimize to put a wind farm that would not be building on top of essential fish habitat or on top of potential cultural resources that have historical significance. We've just finished this project with the University of South Carolina Earth Science Research Institute and the State Archaeological and Anthropology Institute up in Columbia, about 11 to 16 miles off of the North Myrtle Beach area in terms of mapping the bottom for those wind resource potentials. If you've seen these on land, these turbines, they're pretty big, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
They're babies considering what's offshore. The resource is bigger offshore. You don't have quite as many challenges in terms of land access. You've got so many roads and communities and whatnot. It's just not an open slate. Offshore is.
Right.
That is another difference. And along the East Coast, you have a lot of resources. One thing that's happened recently is we've all been looking in the country for when the offshore industry will start. It's happening in Europe and other places for quite some time. We really haven't had an offshore wind industry in the United States. The first 3 turbines are now actually spinning in the U.S. off of Rhode Island. And so everyone, all of the states, South Carolina included, has been looking for when is this going to happen, because there'll be a great deal of industry and development that comes with that. We don't have even the vessels to build these things in this country. So that means vessels are going to be built. There's a General Electric plant in South Carolina that makes wind turbines. I think they moved that manufacturing elsewhere, but those were getting shipped for onshore, not offshore. So as this offshore industry comes, that's going to be a lot of jobs and a lot of interest that many states and communities are vying for. So we're really interested in making sure that we do it right and we have the information. So all those studies have been going on for some time. Our colleagues at Clemson down the road here in North Charleston, they have something they call the drivetrain test facility. They are working with industry to test the drivetrain assemblies for these turbines so that they can be more efficient, be cheaper, and just keep making the cost of energy go down. They're testing, for example, if you think about the turbines that are going in off of, say, Germany or in the North Sea these days, they might be maybe a 3.5 to a 5 megawatt machine. That's something on the order of an Airbus spinning on top of the Washington Monument. That is a very big thing. There's efforts now to build them even taller because the further up you go, the stronger the winds are. So Clemson and some of their colleagues in the industry is looking at what does a 12 megawatt system looks like. The bigger these things get, the more efficient they are, the cheaper they become. But you can try to imagine the forces on something that's that big.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gears and bearings and all those mechanical parts. That is a serious challenge. Our interest is being able to show what the wind and the forcings that are driving these things are. There's turbulence in our atmosphere, and you could have at the scale where it's maybe 100 meters or 200 meters in length between tip to tip of these blades. The top of the blade may see wind going at one direction and the bottom may be seeing it another, and it's amplified over 100 meters of leverage. I mean, these are serious challenges on the engineering world, and Clemson's got a world-class facility down there in North Charleston that's really trying to answer those questions.
That's the kind of over-engineering that has to happen. I mean, it's like trying to build a spaceship. The forces that are involved, you have to be so careful with the calculations and really understand the forces so that you can make sure that you're not going to put a ton of money into a really expensive offshore wind turbine that gets torn apart.
It comes down to risk, right? Everything is a risk in this world. And so we have done a lot of these studies where we've taken a very sophisticated, interactively coupled atmosphere ocean wave model that was developed by colleagues at Coastal here. And it's been really accurate in terms of tropical storms and impacts like that. But we've gone and looked at all the historical storms that have come through the East Coast and simulated those in the model to come up with quantifying the forces that a structure might see, hitting a turbine tower or waves, currents, the wind velocities, and then work with engineering organizations that build things in the ocean. And the question is, how strongly or overbuilding do you do? You really can't have something fall down. That's a very bad day, for one thing. But every little bit stronger you make it, it gets vastly more expensive. So you're always playing that game. What's the risk? It's the same thing with oil platforms offshore. It's the same thing with bridges and everything else. What is that risk? So from the science side that we're rather interested in is if you think about risk in our coastal environments, a lot of it's based on the past behavior of the system. We've got 100 years of weather data, and this is how frequently we've had these kinds of rain events and such. We have had a lot of hurricanes and whatnot, but if you look at the national tracking maps and that NOAA's assembled, but it's not a lot of time series when things might only hit an area once every 20 or 15 years. So we're kind of challenged in really extracting out with great accuracy what a 100-year storm looks like or a 500-year storm looks like. Worse than that, I think, is the fact that we're no longer seeing the system behaving like it did in the past, which is the basis for a lot of these risk projections. So it's been really different the last 5 or 10 years.
It's a moving target. The rule book has kind of been changed in the last 5 or 10 years, and the system is behaving really differently. So we have all this historical data, but is that going to be representative of what it looks like over the next 100 years?
So it means you have to shift off of the dependence on behavioral data from the past into physics-based modeling of how the system actually works. And that's why our focus is on getting more observations that allow us to make those physics-based models more accurate, more reflective of how the world really works on the scales that we need it.
Now, as y'all have been conducting this research and looking at these different ways to build this infrastructure, I'm sure you faced many, many challenges and probably some pushback as well. What are some of the things that y'all have had to deal with while conducting this research?
Well, interestingly, it's the same challenge there is in the science. It's a timescale matter. Why we're so interested in wind energy, several of us have been appointed to our state's floodwater commission by Governor McMaster in trying to deal with the challenges we've had as a state in the last many, many years. And in trying to do this, we really are looking at what would you do tomorrow to solve this problem and what will that cost, as opposed to what you need to do in the longer term. What you might do tomorrow is on one scale. It might be you repaired a road that was damaged, or you might try to keep the drainage ditches as they are more free for flowing and things like that. That's kind of one scale. But you're talking about risks of infrastructure like roadways and bridges and things like that. They don't get built in a day. That doesn't get planned in a day. That's years kind of infrastructure and very expensive. Certainly the debate in this country has been going on for a while where a lot of our infrastructure is rather old and aging and perhaps not been maintained as well as it should. And now we're facing these challenges. So we have some serious expenses ahead of us, and we have some serious expenses that are here every day. And how do we help improve our communities? How do we deal with transportation and education and healthcare and all these kinds of issues that are out there? So when you have a solution or a direction you want to go, and it means a significant change, and it might be an initial cost, somewhere down the line, the cost gets better. You have to balance on the short term and the long term. There's so many pressures on the few dollars that are really available to do things that that's the challenge. So your science really has to be able to convince people that in the long term, this is clearly going to come out. If there's uncertainty in that becomes easier to say, well, we just can't risk the uncertainty because of how much it's going to distract from other activities. So I think the science is getting better and better and better, and the pressures to do something, I think, are coming around, and we're seeing a will to do it. And now we're trying to make sure it's done right, because if you invest in all those things and you overbuild it, just like the offshore wind farms, or underbuild it, that has repercussions. So I think everybody working together and putting the best information together and coming up with the best plan on the short, mid, and long term is really where we need to go. And that's a complicated discussion. It takes some time to have that discussion, but I think we're getting there.
It is really important to have those discussions and for people to just be open to different thoughts of, how can we solve these problems, and to be willing to talk about it and learn about it.
And I think the benefit, again, is a more interdisciplinary approach on the science side. It's interdisciplinary in problem solving, right? These are not just scientific decisions. They're economic decisions. They're social decisions. They're based on historical experiences and frankly, the culture. And all that has to come in the table to find the way forward for society. So I think more dialogue, more discussions, and more respect for other people's perceptions.
I was going to say that as much as I agree, we need to be talking about this as much as we can. It's also the flip side that we need to be listening. Each party involved in the debate obviously has a position that they're trying to defend, but if you spend all of your time in the debate talking and none of it listening, was it really a debate, or was it an opportunity for you to talk at an audience for a while. It's definitely about people being willing to work with each other, even if they have opposing opinions or stances, and listening to the holistic debate as opposed to each individual aspect of it. It's definitely an integrative issue.
One way we try to convey that to some of our students is you go out and look at what the projections of sea level rise will be for the rest of the century, right? And you get a range, and it's a substantial range. And then you ask the question, well, if you're going to be on the lower end of that range, what would your solution be versus it would be on the upper end of the range? Those are very different solutions, potentially, certainly in the short term. So there's a need for continuing to improve the science. There's a need for maybe a little better understanding of statistics and what risk is. And there's a need for really understanding everyone's positions. At the end of the day, these are value judgments, quite frankly, and we need to be working on that.
Yeah. Now, for someone looking to get into this field and to be working on these types of projects, you know, whether they're in high school or maybe undergrad or whatever point in their life they are, what advice would you give to them trying to get into this type of field?
I think particularly in the environmental sciences, marine science, whichever way you want to go, they're interdisciplinary and they're changing. And the fact of the matter is things that you might be working on in 10 or 15 years, 20 years from now don't exist now. I mean, there's entire fields that come into play. So thinking you know what the field is going to be in the future is probably not the best way to approach this. And the fact is, the more you know about a broad interacting system, means you need to know a good bit about math, and you need to know about chemistry and biology and all the things that work into this and bring them together. Now, you can't be the expert in everything, but you have to know enough about everything to talk to the expert, to bring their expertise to your problem. And you can't avoid things. So get interested in everything. You have no idea what classes and what things will be important to you 10 or 20 years from now. So just find the world interesting for what it is. There's a lot of interesting things out there. There's all kinds of interesting things in history. I mean, I assigned a history book for one of my classes in environmental issues. It's a book that looked at the management of the Mississippi River back when there was a large flood back in the 1920s. You flooded an area the size of New England. And it moved populations out of the upper delta up into the cities to the north, and it changed the fabric of the country. This has happened before, but the point for reading that book is if you go through it, some of the technical arguments we were having as a society back in the early part of the last century are the same arguments we're having now about whether to go levees and constrain the flows or allow them to break out. We're having the same arguments. The economic arguments are very similar. The political arguments are very similar. So there's a lot to be drawn from in the experiences we've had from the past that comes from a history book.
This has been fantastic. This has been a really great conversation about a super broad subject, bringing in a lot of the various issues, not only in where this field came from, but also where it's going over the next 1 year, 5 year, 10 years, and 100 years.
Well, maybe the analogy might be to a jigsaw puzzle, right? You can go in and examine very closely any one piece and understand it very well. And then you set it back into the larger mosaic of the puzzle you're putting together. And you have another piece, and you, or as a team, study that. And you have to have both scales, the detail and really clear understanding of how one little piece works, but how it works into this complex mosaic that is our coastal environment is what we really need to do.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for being on the show with us today, and thank you for having us out on this amazing vessel. It's been a great day.
It's been great fun. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Conservation Connection.
If you enjoyed our podcast, go ahead and subscribe to make sure you catch every episode that we post.
We would love to hear from you. If you want to reach out to us, go to our website, lastchanceendeavors.com/contact, and shoot us an email.
If you're a teacher and you'd like to use this episode in your classroom, get in touch with us.
We'll provide you with state and national standard tie-ins and additional materials to help you guide a class discussion.
Thanks again for listening, and don't forget to tune in next week.